Hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We're about to start the last panel of the conference. I thank everybody for staying this long. I, really want to thank also the, those that participated in the student posters session. I don't want to take time at the end of this. We're all tired, so I'm gonna right now thank everybody that helped organize this. I want to, in particular, thank Carrie Ellis for, doing all the work for organizing this. I want to thank also the BIPP executive committee. That some are here. So Geoff Schneider is here. Amanda Wooden was here earlier and left, and Chris Ellis was here for a while at the poster session. So I want to thank everybody for helping supporting this. So without further ado, we're going to have a panel on inequality, structural change, and public policy. We have, this panel is heavy on Bucknell faculty, so we have besides myself, we have Geoff Schneider, Jacob Powell, and Özlem Omer. But we will start with our star and not Bucknell faculty from a lesser liberal arts school, Colgate, Tom Michl. So yes, so we're very happy to have you here, and I'll give you some indications of time.
Okay.
And there is, you have the little thing to pass.
So this is the mic, and everybody can hear me. So thank you for organizing this, Matías, and Carrie for being so efficient. This is a talk about a world with low interest rates. And here, low interest rates means an interest rate below the growth rate. And what happens when the interest rate is below the growth rate is that there's no fiscal cost to deficits. In other words, if you run a deficit and you increase the debt, there's no need to raise taxes in the future to service the debt. It's hard to wrap your mind around that fact. It used to be thought that it was an exceptional circumstance, but now it's very clear that we live in a world of low interest rates. We don't know if that's going to persist, so we need to address that question. And I'm going to address it by looking at a paper that Olivier Blanchard wrote. It was his presidential address in 2018. He's a big deal. He was chief economist at IMF. He defines what the field thinks about this. And of course, this is a super, super important question. So in this paper, a low interest rate is going to mean a negative interest rate because I'm going to assume with Blanchard that the growth rate is 0. And that's just for simplicity. So if you have a low interest rate, it turns out that the government doesn't have a tax in order to service the debt. It actually gives people a negative tax or a subsidy. So you have to sort of wrap your mind around that. The opposite of low interest rates, of course, high interest rates, where you do have to have a tax. And I'm going to look at both of those cases. And I'm also going to look at the intermediate case where there's a 0 interest rate, and there's therefore no tax or subsidy. So let me get this thing going, and here's some background, and I have to apologize because I wrote this, I was sleepwalking, and I was basically thinking, I'll just do a standard economics paper, so it's kind of wonky. So I'm going to try to, break it down a little bit and not pay so much attention to the weeds and just, get into the basic ideas. This is about policy, and there is probably no more important macroeconomic, well, there are more important policies, but the national debt is a huge issue. 25 years ago, the US debt was about 30% of GDP. Since then, because of the global financial crisis, because of COVID, and because of repeated Republican regressive tax cuts, we now have a debt of about 100% of GDP, and it's because of the big ugly bill, it's going up, up, up. So it's a topical issue, and the conventional view, I'm going to start here, is that debt is bad because it crowds out capital and impoverishes the nation. It makes us poorer because we're less productive, we have less capital. I don't believe that story at all. It's neoclassical economics, and it's wrong. But Blanchard starts from there, but he adds a wrinkle, and that is when there are low interest rates, the debt actually can enrich the nation because it overcomes something called dynamic inefficiency, which happens when there's actually too much saving and too much capital. This is all within neoclassical economics. And he develops a model to illustrate the point that when you have low interest rates, not only do you have no cost, no fiscal cost to debt, which is true, that's just arithmetic, but you also can have efficiency gains. So this is a potential conventional argument for debt. I want to make a counter-argument based on a different way of looking at the world, which I've described here as long-run classical, short-run Keynesian. Short-run Keynesian, that's the kind of macro you learn in typical macro course. The long-run classical model follows in the tradition of Ricardo and Marx, and it is an alternative to the neoclassical orthodoxy. So what I want to do is make an apples-to-apples comparison with Blanchard's model, using many of his same assumptions and notation, but I'm going to strip out the neoclassical elements and replace it with a kind of classical or Keynesian synthesis kind of alternative. And to do that, and this actually connects up with Derek's talk, is I'm going to build in a social structure to the accumulation process that looks like a capitalist society. Capitalism without capitalists is like Hamlet without the prince. Blanchard's model is a classless model. He assumes that there is a life cycle saver. It's called an overlapping generations model. Typical agent saves during working years and then consumes in retirement. I think Stefan's paper, he's probably not here, but oh, there you are. Yeah, that was the model he used. So that's all Blanchard uses. So in that world, the capitalists are retired workers because they're the ones who own the capital stock. And there are no capitalists. So I'm going to build in a capitalist class and a social structure of accumulation so that my model looks like a lot more like the world that Derek described last night, which is a very high concentration of wealth. And it turns out I'm going to use a version, the Kaldor-Passinetti model developed in the 50s, and it really is a classical in its character. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. The first is normal utilization. This is kind of wonky. I've written a lot about this over the last couple of years, and if you do this kind of work, I've got a paper in JPKE and one forthcoming in Roque that basically says that in the dynamics of wages and prices will give you normal utilization. So I'm going to assume that in the long run that's true. The second thing I'm going to assume is more controversial, and that is that there's really no difference between saving and investment. Now, Blanchard and neoclassical economists do the same thing when they build long-run models. So I'm doing an apples-to-apples course kind of comparison, and so I think this makes my model fit for purpose, which is to critique the Blanchard diamond model that I just described. This is mainly a polemical exercise. I don't think the model I'm going to show you is a good representation of actually existing capitalist societies, but I do think it's a good framework for clarifying some of the issues around national debt, public debt. So the other objective is I'm going to make, in a sense, a critique of what's called functional finance, which is the idea that you use the debt as a kind of balance wheel to stabilize demand. Now that's been around a long time. It was developed by Abel Lerner back in the 40s. It's been made very popular by something called modern monetary theory that you may well have read about. It's big at the Levy Institute, by the way. But functional finance is broader than that. There are people who aren't in modern monetary theory, like Peter Scott or Eckhard Schlicht in Germany, who have developed the same basic idea. The problem with it that I'm going to identify is that it ignores the effect of debt on distribution, the distribution of income, the distribution of wealth, and the distribution of consumption. And I'm going to argue that even when there are low interest rates, debt is regressive, has a regressive effect on those distributions. Now, I started working on this before the global financial crisis, and I developed a model, but I assumed high interest rates, because at the time I thought that was reasonable, and also because I didn't really have an alternative theory of the interest rate that I liked. And so I just cut some corners. And now I'm returning to this because this, as I mentioned, the issue of low interest rates is much more salient today, given the experience of basically 10 years where we've had negative interest rates, often. So what I'm going to do, as I mentioned, is use Blanchard's basic model, but strip out his neoclassical assumptions and replace them with a class struggle is in there too, a class structure of accumulation, and also going to take away the production function, which if you've had a course in macroeconomics, you've seen Cobb-Douglas production functions. We don't believe they exist. We think that it's like the Yeti. It's just a cryptid. It doesn't exist. So that's the main structure. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say? Nope, that's pretty much it. So here's a little math, but it's not that hard. Basic assumptions, the government is just managing debt, there's no spending, that's just to simplify. And as I mentioned, when the interest rate is greater than, this is the interest factor, it's 1 plus the interest rate, and everything is going to be a factor, not a rate. So this is at 1 plus the interest rate. When it's greater than 1, that means the interest rate is positive, and you have a tax. If it's negative, you have a subsidy. The second equation is the solvency condition, which establishes what I just said. You don't have to worry about that. The third is the assumption that we have a zero growth economy. That's Blanchard's assumption, and that just creates a nice, stable, simple environment. Now, the class structure of accumulation is based on the idea that we have workers and capitalists. The workers, I assume, save a constant fraction of their lifetime wealth, which consists of their wages after taxes. I think it's a pretty reasonable structural assumption, and I don't think Keynesians and classical economists would quibble with it. I'm also going to assume what's called Leontief technology, which means there's no well-behaved production function, there's a constant relationship between capital and output. There are no marginal products. Finally, constant equity premium, that means the interest rate, RF is the interest factor, is just a constant fraction of the profit rate. So there are 2 rates, and those are factors, not rates. The workers hold debt as a retirement vehicle, and they also own capital ownership, which is equity. So phi, or fee, or whatever that is the share of capital ownership held by workers. And the rest, of course, is held by capitalists. The capitalists save a constant fraction of their net wealth. They live off their capital ownership. And I'm going to assume that they don't buy any debt. For example, they may be risk tolerant, whereas workers may be more risk averse. So that might be an explanation of what's going on here. This is a strong assumption because in reality, capitalists own the vast majority of the debt. So you would want to generalize this, but to do that, you would have to develop a better understanding of that relationship between the interest rate and the profit rate. So again, fit for purpose, this assumption. So here are some basic accounting equations. The first one just says that wages and profits are inversely related. So we're going to see when the profit rate goes up, wages go down. Pretty straightforward. Consumption and growth, the same thing, except remember, we're assuming the growth rate is 0, so the growth factor is 1, that's G. So consumption is pinned down by the technology and this growth assumption. But the distribution of consumption, the last equation, 5 minutes, woo. This is where you're going to see some action. debt is going to affect the distribution between workers and capitalists. And then the right-hand side, it's also going to affect the distribution of worker consumption between active workers and retired workers. So it's going to make consumption more unequal. That's the result I get. So now, quickly, I'm going to skip through this slide. This is the core of the model. It's a couple of versions of the saving equations of workers and capitalists. I'm going to show you a graph, and you'll, I think, get some intuition. If you have a zero rate of interest, okay, there's no tax and no subsidy. So debt has no effect on consumption and saving by the workers and capitalists. Consequently, it doesn't affect what the laissez-faire equilibrium which you get with no debt. So R star, that's the laissez-faire equilibrium. It obeys the basic saving equation of the capitalists. And that determines the rate of profit. That determines the rate of profit. Because the growth rate is given, okay, and their saving rate then determines the rate of profit. This is called the Cambridge theorem, because it basically says that worker saving has no effect on income distribution. This was discovered by Luigi Passanetti. So what worker saving affects is phi. And you can see that it depends on beta, which is the worker saving propensity. Workers save more, they own a bigger share of the capital stock. What happens if you have debt, in this case, is that workers' share of the capital stock goes down because they're substituting debt for capital ownership in their retirement plan. And it's a one-for-one thing. And that's going to happen in all the other cases I look at, high and low interest rates. But there you're going to get general equilibrium effects on the distribution of income between wages and profits. And that's something that the Blanchard model doesn't really deal with. So I don't have much time, so this is those two equations I told you I was going to talk about later. This is what happens when you have a high interest rate, and the take home there is that point B is with debt, point A is without debt. You get a higher rate of profit. And this is the Cambridge theorem in action. What's going on here is that the capitalists have to pay a tax to service the debt. So in order to maintain that growth equilibrium, they have to have a higher rate of profit. Have to have a higher rate of profit. And of course, the workers' share of capital ownership goes down. So we'll see, I'll look at what happens to consumption. Oops. I'm not very good at this. This is the low interest rate case. Now this is kind of interesting because now the capitalists are getting a subsidy. So in this case, the rate of profit actually goes down because you don't need as high a rate of profit in order to meet that growth assumption. And so this looks like it might be progressive. It's good for workers. Their wages go up. But it turns out, no, it's not good for workers. Their share of capital ownership goes down. And you can show that their consumption will also go down, So here's what happens to consumption in all these cases. Look at the top panel. CW is worker consumption. It always goes down. Capitalist consumption always goes up. Worker consumption goes down. It also affects the distribution between active workers and retired workers. I'm going to skip over that. The bottom panel shows what happens with something I call the transfer paradox. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. This just repeats what we just said about the effects of debt on the rate of profit and the worker share of capital ownership. But the bottom panel shows what happens when you tax the capitalist more. 2 minutes, okay, I can do this. If you increase the tax on capitalists, it has a paradoxical effect. If you have a high rate of interest on the right-hand side, the red, it raises the rate of profit. It impoverishes workers. Reducing their taxes impoverishes workers. Their taxes go down, but their wages go down by more. Pretty wild, huh? It's a transfer. But in the opposite case, in the low interest rate case, if you tax the capitalists more, you're not taxing them, you're subsidizing them more. They don't need as high a rate of profit to meet your growth assumption. And so workers actually benefit in that case. And you can also show that consumption follows the same pattern. If you have a high interest rate, working class consumption goes down, even though they're paying less taxes, and vice versa with low interest rates. I think this is a really good illustration of how the social relations of production of capitalism inhibit economic policy. I mean, it's pretty abstract, but it gets the point across. Okay, concluding comments, how much time I have? Okay, so, I think you've got the basic message. That's regressive effects should be taken more seriously, including by people like the functional finance people. And I'm just going to editorialize here. The alternative to this way of looking at debt is to recognize that good public policy would do something like what Derek talked about. It would democratize wealth ownership and make, in my opinion, what we would should aim for, is what Joan Robinson called the nation as rentier. We should tax capital, tax the wealthy, and put it in a trust fund, like the Social Security Trust Fund, which would then function like a college endowment and subsidize things like Social Security and Medicare, and it would socialize wealth. I think it's complementary to what Derek Baby Bonds proposal is doing. I have very little time, so I'm just going to say that I don't think dynamic inefficiency is a very useful way of looking at the world because it depends on this classless society. I think the transfer paradox is a good way of dramatizing the way social relations of production constrain economic policy. And finally, I think there's more work that needs to be done on alternative closures, for example, to make the model more realistic. I think you want to make the growth rate a variable in the model, and I've actually done that and gotten similar results. But this is actually, even this paper is still preliminary. I also think the assumption I started with, that investment and saving are the same, is not satisfactory, and we need to have a model in which asset prices play a role in coordinating saving and investment. And I'll just leave it at that. I think there's a lot more work that could be done by heterodox, structuralist, Keynesian, and classical economists on this topic.
One will be Geoff, Professor Schneider.
All right, afternoon, everybody. My apologies to those of you who have heard most of this before. I think Annie and Olivia, you could probably give this presentation by now. But I do want to also thank Sanaya for helping me update the data in this. So there is at least some new numbers. Okay, so South Africa, apartheid ended 31 years ago, and things are not better. So I think this is one of the most striking experiments in economics that people don't talk about. It's really one of the most dramatic policy failures in modern history. And so I think in that sense, this is worth talking about in some detail. All right, so I'm not going to go into detail on apartheid, but basically, just to remind everybody, it was systematic, organized, racialized oppression under a state capitalist system. The idea was to separate the races, but also to have white people do all the skilled work and black people do all the unskilled work, and races should live separately. So it was organized, legal segregation. Also, the other key thing to remember is that South Africa under apartheid, towards the end of it, became a pariah state, and so it became cut off from most of the global economy. Their export sector was connected. They exported gold and diamonds to the rest of the world, but they started producing things for themselves because nobody would sell them a lot of things. So they started producing oil from coal very inefficiently because they couldn't get oil from the Arab countries. And they started making steel because nobody would sell them steel. So as they became a pariah, they started producing everything themselves. The point being, they were sort of largely separated from the global economy when apartheid ended. Much in some ways as the communist countries were when they started their own market reform. So there's some interesting parallels there. So apartheid ended 31 years ago. Black South Africans now have political rights and no longer suffer legal discrimination, but their economic outcomes have declined. And again, this is, to me, is just outrageous in that, the end of a racial oppressive system did not make the lives of the average black South African better. It made it worse. So this is This is really a case of South Africa trading racial apartheid for market apartheid, where market apartheid has fueled inequality even more than racial apartheid, which is, again, really stunning. Okay, too much. Okay, so there was a negotiated compromise. Look, when Mandela was released from prison, he was saying we should nationalize the mines and the banks and redistribute assets. So that's where he was when he was released from prison in 1990. By the time that he was elected president of South Africa in 1994, he had changed. He had been convinced by the World Bank and the IMF and other mainstream economists that they should embrace neoliberalism because it would bring investment and growth and it would make the black population better off. So he was basically sold a theory from the World Bank that neoliberalism would make people better off who were, historically oppressed. So what you may not know is there was a long history of both conservative libertarian economists and the business community basically saying, apartheid's an awful system, but if we just get rid of it, the market will fix things. So famous Austrian-style economist in South Africa, W.H. Hutz, says competition is essentially an equalitarian force because you have to be efficient, so that means you have to hire the best person, so you can't be racist if you are in a competitive market system. Not possible. So what happens then is they mount this campaign to convince Mandela and the ANC that the market will fix the problems in South Africa. So the ideology of the market is developed to take the place of apartheid ideology. As a classic example, land reform, almost all the land was in the hand of whites, including the Afrikaners that Trump thinks are oppressed somehow. And so land reform, in a market-based sense, though, they started saying, well, we can't give it to anybody because we don't want to hurt our productivity. So they would basically make the argument, oh, well, if we could only redistribute land to productive farmers. And then it just happens that all the productive farmers are white. So therefore, you can't actually redistribute land. So very convenient, right, how the arguments all of a sudden fuel the maintenance of the existing distribution system. Meanwhile, in probably one of the great strokes of evil genius, the business community creates a black economic empowerment program in which they basically create a black front for white-owned companies. So they would take somebody like the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, and they would basically set him up to run a business, and then it would all be their money, and they would get the profits, which they would share with him, but they would set it up so that these new black-owned businesses could get concessionary mining rights and things like that. So you have this elite of the ANC profiting from businesses, but it's such a narrow slice, right? It's really only Cyril Ramaphosa making the money for a white business, right? So it basically, again, is preserving the existing status quo. Okay, so they also then are forced under threat of the IMF and the World Bank to undergo what we would normally call a structural adjustment program. It technically wasn't, but effectively, if you look at the policies, they were what is usually forced on an indebted country. So they basically told South Africa, if you do not rein in your spending and pay off the debt that was run up during apartheid, the money that was used to oppress the black population, in fact, if you do not pay that off, then we'll cut you off from funding. So they felt like they had no choice. When Mandela took over, they basically had no money to spend on anything to help out the black population because they had to use it all to pay down the debt. So they had severe austerity. They were also forced to liberalize financial markets. And anybody who studies markets knows if you take a closed market and open it up, the money's going to leave, especially if people are worried about the future, right? So the uncertainty in South Africa makes financial markets just think, all right, my money would be safer in London. So there's a massive exodus of capital. Dramatic reduction of tariffs. So all those protected industries that they developed when they were a pariah, all close. Privatization of state-owned enterprises. So, well, who has the money in post-apartheid South Africa. Again, not the black population, right? Not the poor population. So, ironically, one of the most destructive was probably austerity because it prevented investment in education and infrastructure, which was so unequal. So, the government has done a few good things. They established a limited welfare state. The government allocated 12% of its spending on social expenditures. It's sort of modeled after the Bolsa Familia. If we put money into poor communities, then good things will happen. So this was good. Now I want you to think about something. The government has spent a significant amount of money on poor people, and inequality and poverty is worse. So what does that tell us about the rest of the policies and the impact that they have had, right? Without this, it's hard to even imagine what would be happening. Okay, so inequality has worsened. So apartheid, this unbelievably unequal system along racial lines, inequality got worse since the end of apartheid. Again, still one of the things I'm most stunned by. It happened in two waves. First, when all the manufacturing closed, all the jobs got lost, it got worse. And then there was a second wave as the government started getting less and less efficient, as the austerity policies kicked in. And the consequences have been staggering, a 38% increase in inequality. I mean, so here's the end of apartheid, and here's what happens to the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality. I mean, it just explodes, right? And then it's stuck, right? So it's stuck at a level of 0.74, and it's not moving, no matter what the government is doing right now, right? So it's almost like it is permanently entrenched inequality in South Africa, at the highest rate in the world, right? South Africa is now the world's most unequal country. South Africa also has the worst level of intergenerational earnings mobility, which means if you...
We're giving you a run for the money.
Well, I know, Brazil is trying, right? Yeah. But, I mean, absolute dead last in terms of, I mean, so if you're born poor, you stay poor, right? That's what that tells us. Because the education is so unequal, right? Because they were never able to make the investments. Okay, so, and you know, this is just an actual picture from South Africa. On the right, well, yeah, on the right we have the shacks where the poor people live. On the left, we have the nice section of town, and all cities in South Africa are like this. There's the poor neighborhoods, often just across the highway from the rich neighborhoods, but the level of difference is unbelievable.
Just to be clear, the people that live on the left are the ones Trump says is oppressed.
Yeah.
People who oppress the Afrikaners on the left.
Yeah, they got it bad. Wealth inequality has also gotten worse. I'm just going to cover this quickly, but basically steady upward trend in wealth inequality. It's stabilized at an outrageous level. Just so you know, this is not the richest 1%. This is the richest 0.1%, right? So we're talking about an incredibly narrow slice that has most of the money. Like, I mean, it really is stunning when you're there, right? The rich people live like kings. I mean, it's unbelievable. And they also, it feels still like apartheid, right? They still have all these servants. They don't do any of the hard work. I mean, it really is stunning the extent to which it is, at least economically, the same. I mean, it's not oppressive. At least people aren't getting beaten in the streets like they used to. But in terms of the actual economic outcomes, it is, well, worse. There's been deindustrialization. The unemployment rate exploded. It's now officially, I mean, look at the trend is obvious, but it's also not going anywhere. They're not able to fix this, right? It's stuck at over 30%. That's the official rate. The unofficial rate, we actually think it's closer to 42%. Can you imagine having a 42% unemployment rate and what that would do to your society? I mean, that's worse than our depression, right? Manufacturing decline, and this is basically on the same level as the worst performing industrial economies. You see some Latin American economies having a similar downturn in manufacturing. South Africa is equivalent to that, basically. So the worst performance, some of the worst in the world. This has been exacerbated by various inefficiencies in how the government has run. Just to show you another example of how bad things are, Africa is not in general known for its positive economic performance, And South Africa is near the bottom of Africa, right? So their average economic growth rate barely registers since the end of apartheid. So this is, for the last period since the end of apartheid. Almost everybody in sub-Saharan Africa is performing better than South Africa. Here's per capita GDP, which is basically stagnated in the last decade. So their economy really is just stuck. Capital flight has exploded, right? As I mentioned, then when they opened up financial markets, they basically made it very easy to take money out of the country. So all of their big firms like Anglo-American Mining moved its headquarters to London. So all of the money that is generated there is leaking out in the form of profits and transfers. Land is still in white hands. So you notice 72% of land is in white hands still. Apartheid's been over 30 years, 72% of land, and all the good land is still in white hands. So again, land reform, not really a thing. I already mentioned this, so I'm going to also mention, though, that they're trying to use social entrepreneurship to fix this. So they throw a tiny little bit of money at, they have a law that says 1% of corporate profits have to go to help the community. And that's not nothing, but it's not much more than nothing. All right, so their government, because it was so hollowed out by austerity, is basically unable to implement anything really technical, any good industrialization policy. So the hollowing out of the state, one of the worst examples of that is they can't provide electricity with any certainty. So they can't provide basic public services at this point. The other weird thing about it is how unchanging the racial dynamics are. You still have whites living with whites and socializing with whites, and blacks socializing with blacks and only blacks, and coloreds associating with coloreds. That's a South African term for mixed race, which they still use, which is also weird. But lots of people report experiencing racism. So again, it just feels like so little has changed since the market system was introduced. Their stats, 5th highest crime rate in the world. I mean, not surprising, right? When you have the world's most unequal economy, then people are desperate. There's a lot of desperate people, and so you get a lot of street crime, which means all the houses have razor wire around them. So it's like if you have any money, you have to build yourself a castle. Carjacking is just exploded. So you're driving down the road in Cape Town, you'll see the sign, right? There's so much carjacking, they just warn you about it because you never know when people are just going to block the road and you're going to get carjacked. So much so that they were selling a Mercedes and a BMW that had a flamethrower as an attachment that you could get. So what we have learned from South Africa, then, I would argue, is that in the face of long-standing racial disparities and strong group identities, neoliberalism exacerbates inequality. Now, in general, my students will tell you the history of free markets, generally, inequality increases, right? That's what we've seen over and over again. That's what we saw in the US when we had a laissez-faire system. That's what happened in England. Well, we've now added another example of that in South Africa, right? But we've added that in a particular context. So you have to add the racial dimension to it because it's so prevalent. So in some ways, I think the evidence from South Africa is it's even worse in that context, right? So unlike the economists who argued that the market system would actually tend to erode inequalities, it has done just the opposite. So what do we need? I like that Derek Hamilton last night talked about things like a universal basic income, right? I mean, these are the basics. This would stabilize things. You've got to have a redistribution of income, right? You cannot have all of the land continuing to be in the hands of wealthy whites in a country that's diverse like that. You have to probably stop the outflow of money, so you're going to have to introduce capital controls. All of this stuff would require a political realignment, and the ANC, quite frankly, is too involved in it. They've made too much money, right? A narrow slice of the black elite has made huge amounts of money in this process, and that's part of the increase in inequality. But if you look at the average numbers, the average black South African is not experiencing that. So it's really this alliance of kind of crony capitalist ANC elite with white business interests and farm interests that has made the inequality so bad. Thank you.